Moving on to the 15-mark question, let's have a shot at this. So with reference to Extract D, discuss possible methods of government intervention to reduce electronic waste. So straight off, what am I thinking is asking us of methods of government intervention. What does that remind you of? What topic does that remind you of? Straight off the bat, that reminds me of market failure. Since why do governments intervene in the market? The governments intervene in the market to try solve the market. And it's usually since there is some sort of market failure they're trying to solve. For example, sugar tax, things like that. That is an example of a market failure where the government has to intervene to solve or internalise that negative externality. And now it's also talking about electronic waste, and electronic waste sounds like an example that could be a negative externality. So this question, it looks like from first glance, it could be asking us essentially methods to solve market failure, the methods to solve market failure from a negative externality. But of course, for your 50-mark question, you will have those 3 application marks. So let's have a good look at the extract and see what it is referring to. So Extract D, title, the growing problem with electronic waste, and let's have a read through this. Initially, at the start of the extract, there are a lot of stats, which of course will be quite useful when we are going to use them, quote them in the extract to pick up those application marks. But then, towards the end of the extract, in this last line, line 10, it does confirm my suspicion of the market failure, where it talks about external costs. But let's keep reading. So policymakers have a long list of options to combat this problem, including strict regulation. Of course, that is one method, that is one example of a method the government can solve this market failure. Environmental education, another method which of course does help solve market failure. Why? We saw this again, referring back to the sugar tax example. Before the government ruled out sugar tax, which is quite strict regulation, they tried things like providing education in the NHS, for example, handing out leaflets on weight loss, handing out leaflets on the negative effects on sugar. Why? Since if they can educate the population can now make an informed decision. Since in market failure, one of the biggest problems is a lack of information, that information gap, since individuals do not fully understand, cannot comprehend the long-term effects of consuming sugar on their health. Therefore, they overconsume. And by providing education, the government hopes to now solve that information gap, meaning that individuals are making an informed decision, and if they're making an informed decision, they will likely reduce their consumption of sugar. So yeah, that is definitely another strategy which can be used to solve market failure. Of course, all these strategies to combat government failure are flashcards on the You Do Econ website. But then also we have taxation, like we mentioned, of course, sugar tax, the biggest and the most effective method to solve market failures usually, and then financial incentives. Then it goes on to say, in some countries, household rubbish is weighed and recycling initiatives are subsidised. So that could be another method we can use to solve this market failure. Now, especially in my life classes, since market failure is such a common topic, we say in A-level economics for Edexcel, the 3 big topics, and especially the 2 big topics, are market failure and market structures. That is by yield, that is by weighting, so how much it comes up in the exam, and accounting for how much content they make up as well. So an absolute classic question you will get is how to solve a market failure. Just like this, it could come up in 25-mark questions, it's come up in 15s, it's come up in slightly smaller questions before as well. And what I advise students in the live classes is, if possible, always use these 2 policies, which is the main one is tax. The reason why I advise tax, massive chain of analysis. Of course, you can draw the diagram, the negative externality diagram with a tax, pick up a lot of marks from that. And if you've practiced that paragraph, you know how to implement the diagram. It's an absolute A-star paragraph. Then the second one, of course, you can use a range of different policies. So here they've listed a few like regulation, providing education. But there's, of course, lots more like pollution permits. There are maximum, minimum prices, etc., etc. But the one I suggest students to use, which is actually listed here, is of course subsidies. Now subsidies, it is quite a year 12 topic, but if you know how to develop it, if you know how to add the correct depth, if you know how to draw the diagram and manipulate the diagram well, it can be a really great A-star paragraph. So they are the 2 big topics, they're the 2 big points I would, if you're writing a market failure essay, I would focus on those two main points. Okay, so like I said, the 2 methods I'm going to use for this question, the 2 paragraphs I'm going to write is, number 1 is a tax. And if you want to be specific, what type of tax is this going to be? Of course, it is going to be an indirect tax. Pretty much in market failure, whenever you speak about tax, it is always an indirect tax. And who am I going to tax? So now I'm going to have a read of the extract and see who is going to be most appropriate to put this tax on. Whether it's most appropriate to put it on, let's have a look. So I would set this tax on electronics themselves. What does that mean? If you set a tax on electronics themselves, it means it's more expensive for producers to produce electronics. This means, of course, producers are likely to pass on that increased price, that increased cost to consumers. And then how does this affect consumers? As we know, the law of demand, so if you look at the demand curve, there's an inverse relationship between price and quantity demanded. So as price increases, quantity demanded falls. So now with electronics being more expensive, it means people, consumers, households will demand less electronics. If they demand less electronics, it means less electronics are purchased. If there's less electronics purchased, of course there's less electronics to waste. Therefore, we can reduce the wastage of electronics by individuals just purchasing less electronics. Also, if electronics are more expensive, individuals, households are more incentivized to keep hold of that good, to keep using that good, since of course electronics are very expensive now with the tax, so there's a very low incentive to go buy new electronic and just throw this one away. There's more incentive to try reuse, try to find another usage for this good, therefore of course reducing the waste of electronics. Let's get started with answering the question. Of course, we're talking about market failure, externalities, taxes. We have to include the diagram here. It's of utmost importance. Why? Your chain of analysis without the diagram, the amount of marks you can get without this diagram are very limited. With the diagram, there's no upper limit, of course. The upper limit is 15, but it just means that you can achieve the highest band. But yeah, so on your y-axis, of course, since this is an externality diagram, it's cost/benefit on your y-axis, quantity, output, whatever you want to put on your x-axis. But yeah, let's get started with this. So firstly, simple demand curve, but in your negative externality diagrams, what does your demand curve equal? Demand equals marginal private benefit, which also equals marginal social benefit. So they are both equal. And then we have our supply curve, which supply equals marginal private cost. And then we have our marginal social cost curve, which is above, is a higher cost/benefit than our marginal private cost. So this is marginal social cost. And that is, for very simply, that is an externality diagram completed, the curve's completed, but now we add that next level of depth, which allows us to develop that chain of analysis. So let's get this diagram labeled up. Of course, initially we have our market equilibrium, where supply equals demand, where marginal private benefit equals marginal social benefit equals marginal private cost. So this is, of course, just going to label this QE, and then of course where marginal social cost equals demand, this is now our socially efficient equilibrium. This is our equilibrium best for society. I'm going to label that QSE. So what is the difference between QSE and QE? This is the overproduction, the level of overproduction, which I am of course going to label on and just label it up, overproduction. And what does this overproduction between QSE and QE create? It creates welfare loss, where due to producing too many units, society loses out on welfare. And where can we show this on the diagram? And the biggest tip I always give in the live classes is where supply equals demand on these diagrams, you go, essentially where the market equilibrium is, you go up or down to the curve you've changed. So you follow the socially efficient curve. So in this example, the socially efficient curve is above the market equilibrium, which means that will be the triangle of welfare loss, which I'll just quickly label up there. And now just make sure you label it up, and that is of course the net welfare loss. So how would I get started with my chain of analysis? I would start at the market equilibrium. So in the free market, the electronics market reaches equilibrium where supply equals demand, leading to the price mechanism allocating a quantity of QE. At QE, there is an overproduction of electronics. This leads to wastage of electronics. Thus, the government would want to intervene, or we would like to push back the production of electronics to the socially efficient equilibrium, which is at that point there. Why? Since at the socially efficient equilibrium, there's less production of electronics, thus like I explained to you before, if there's less production, there's a few reasons why there's actually going to be less wastage. So if they're producing less, it means that it'll of course push price up, therefore leading to less demand. Less demand leads to less wastage. This overproduction between QSE and QE leads to external costs. It leads to a misallocation of resources, which we can see by the net welfare loss triangle. And as the government's role is to maximise welfare for society, the government intervenes. And how does the government intervene? The government wants to intervene to reduce that overproduction. It wants to get rid of that net welfare loss. So what does the government do? The government sets an indirect tax on producers of electronic goods. The indirect tax increases producers' private cost of production, so therefore it increases MPC. Thus MPC shifts now to this point, MPC plus tax. And that is of course since a tax makes production more costly, and if production is more costly, producers will not be able to produce the same amount of units since it's more expensive, thus they will reduce the amount they're producing, thus causing a shifting of the supply curve, which we can see here from S equals MPC to now this point here. This tax therefore means that now production is pushed back from QE to now QSE, since now we're producing at this point. And what is that point? That point is the socially efficient equilibrium. Therefore, that means if we're producing at QSE, it means we're no longer overproducing, thus there is no net welfare loss now. Society is getting maximum welfare and not losing it. And this therefore now means that the negative production externality has been internalized. There is no longer a negative production externalities, since, like we said, due to the less production of the good, it's going to increase the price of the good. By increasing the price due to the inverse law of demand, it's going to, with higher prices, there's less demand. If there's less demand, there's less wastage. For several reasons, as goods are more expensive, they will choose to reuse, maybe stay with the same good instead of buying a new one. For example, a new phone, if new phones are really expensive, they will likely stay with the original phone instead of purchasing a new phone. And that is pretty much exactly how I'd write it. Of course, at the end, link it back to the question. But if you can mention those key terms, market failure is all about this is why in the life classes I emphasize content mastery is so key. You can't just know how to recall this diagram. This is not a diagram you need to recall. This is a diagram you need a depth of understanding on. You need to understand what these points mean. What does marginal private cost mean? What does external cost mean? What does the net welfare loss mean? What does overproduction mean? You need to understand all these key terms. External cost. It's all about depth with this diagram. Understand the depth of the diagram. That will mean that you're confident to then include it in your chain of analysis and pick up those important, those A-star marks in the chain of analysis. Like the key terms: internalizing the negative externality, overproduction, marginal social cost, misallocation of resources, and like I said again, internalizing the negative externality. These are key terms you need to know and fully understand and be able to grasp. Be confident enough that you can teach someone about it, which means you're confident with knowing it. Of course, that is the main chain of analysis, but 100%, like I did say, you need to include, I was just giving you the main content knowledge there, but of course, for the 15 mark questions, you need to make sure you include the application. There is loads of application. There's no excuse here to not pick up the maximum application marks, as I've just did by scanning through. There's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, just infinite number of stats you can include here to help you pick up the application marks. 100% make sure you do use this application. But anyway, let's move on to the second part of the paragraph, which is of course the evaluation. And like I said before, if you've practiced, and like I said in the life classes, these two big topics, market structures and market failure, if you've practiced these questions, they are so incredibly easy to smash out the park, since pretty much for all market failure questions, the evaluations are exactly the same. So once you've practiced, once you've done essay practice on these A-star evaluation points, you can pretty much just reuse. Of course, questions I say, they never really repeat, they rhyme. So they're very similar, but they won't be exactly the same. This means all you need to do with your A-star evaluation points, you just need to slightly adapt them and they'll work perfectly for the question. And the first and main evaluation point, which I'm sure I've mentioned in another exam paper video, it is the size of the tax. So how in evaluation, this depends on the size of the tax. Since when I implemented the tax, I said MPC plus tax is where marginal social cost is, which means this coincidentally meant that the tax is at the socially efficient equilibrium, which of course is perfect, since now there's no longer any overproduction. We're at the socially efficient equilibrium. The negative externality has been completely internalized. But in reality, the government has imperfect information. There is no way to quantify where the socially efficient equilibrium is. Thus, the government essentially just have to make their best guess at where the socially efficient equilibrium is and try set the tax equal to that, which of course, as a few of you might be thinking, this can definitely lead to government failure, since if the government determine the socially efficient equilibrium at the wrong point, they may set the tax too large or they may set the tax too small, and of course in both scenarios they're problematic and again causing government failure. Now the main scenario I would speak about in the chain of analysis is, and the most possible scenario is if the government set the tax too small. And what is the problem if they set the tax here, where the green line is, so where MPC plus tax is? This of course would mean that the negative externality has not been internalized, since of course if you look at this green triangle I'm going to draw, that shows still the remaining net welfare loss, and of course there is still a slight overproduction from QE to QE1 to QSE. So even though, and this is why we can say it causes government failure, the government tried to intervene to maximise the allocation of resources, tried to solve the market failure. However, they intervene in the market, they set a tax, they distort the price mechanism, and still they do not internalize that negative externality, thus of course cause a government failure. Since of course the definition of government failure is when the government intervene in the market and do not improve or make the allocation of resources worse than before. But yeah, of course there's lots of information there, lots of key terms there, but it's an absolute, if I had to define an A-star evaluation point, it probably would be the exact definition of it. Okay, so one of the most popular videos on my channel when as of time recording, it is very few years ago now, but it is an evaluation video. And one of the main things I mentioned in that evaluation video is always question the assumptions. And I mention it all the time. Economics is built upon assumptions. Literally the first thing you learn in year 12 is ceteris paribus, which is an assumption. And here, like I always say, read through your chain of analysis and then try to get your evaluation since it's specific. One of the main assumptions we made in our chain of analysis was that by the government setting a tax on producers, that tax is going to be passed on to consumers. So that is usually what happens. So when you set a tax on producers, the producers are going to transfer that price, that cost of the tax onto consumers with higher prices. But of course, that is an assumption and it does not always happen. Since in this scenario, the producers could just firm the tax. They could just take it on and take reduced profits and take reduced profit margins, thus meaning the price for consumers' electronics would not increase at all, thus meaning if we use the inverse law of demand to explain that quantity demanded would decrease, therefore the amount of wastage would decrease, but if the price does not change, it means quantity demanded stays exactly the same, which means wastage does not also change, which of course acts as a perfect evaluation point to our point. So the way I'd word it is, however, in evaluation, this depends on the assumption that producers would pass on the cost of the tax to consumers, and that is an absolute great evaluation point. And for those of you who know what this means, it's essentially talking about the tax incidence. What burden of the tax is placed on consumers versus producers? So in this scenario, we're essentially saying all the burden of the tax is going to be on the producers, whereas usually it would be shared between the producers and the consumer. And for this question, I could literally go through 15 A-star evaluation points, but of course we have to move on and we have to keep going with the question. But well, like I'm saying, lots of evaluation points here, but here are just a few which work quite well. Okay, so moving on to the second paragraph, like I said, it is going to be a subsidy. So firstly, first distinction, who are we subsidizing? You could pick quite a few different shareholders who you want to subsidize. You could subsidize the electronic producers to produce more eco-friendly goods, therefore more recyclable goods. So when these goods are thrown away to recycle, it's easier. But I think for the chain of analysis, for the most depth and the easiest one, is just subsidizing the recycling firms themselves. Okay, so when we subsidize a firm, how does it affect a firm? By subsidizing a firm, of course, what does it do? It causes the cost of production for these producers to be lowered. So a producer's cost of production is lowered. So how do we show that on a diagram? Of course, we show that by the supply curve shifting out from, these are a bit of wonky supply curves, but you show that by shifting out the supply curve from S to S plus subsidy. Now, of course, we have our demand curve as well. Now, by the subsidy lowering the producer's cost of production, this increases profitability for the firm. And if we go back to one of our main assumptions is that firms are profit maximizers. And if firms are profit maximizers, if now they have increased profitability, what are they likely to do? They want to maximize on that profitability, so they're going to produce more units. Essentially, with lower costs, there's a clear incentive to increase output. Why? Since there's that potential that they will make profit. Thus what we see on the subsidy diagram, we see quantity increasing from QE, which is before the subsidy, to now QSE. And of course, a little trick I always tend to tell students in the live classes is in this scenario, we're specifically talking about subsidizing recycling firms. So just add that bit of application to your diagram. So what we can do is, instead of quantity, we can say quantity of recycling firms or recycling goods, and then for price we can say price of recycling goods. So just small little things, but it does give you that just a bit more application. And of course the shift out from supply to S plus sub does also lower the market price, but the main thing is the quantity has increased from QE to QSE, which what does that actually mean in terms of the question? It means there's more goods being recycled. If there's more electronics goods being recycled, it of course means less wastage, which does solve the problem in the question, and is a type of government intervention which will help reduce the electronic waste. Now that is a decent chain of analysis, but of course you can add a bit more depth, make this paragraph a bit more A-star-ish paragraph by adding your content knowledge, and you should know how to do this, on consumer and producer surplus. So before and after the subsidy, how does the consumer and producer surplus change respectively? So first thing I'm going to do is just label up all the points on the diagram which help me use it. So A, B, P, E. What does that triangle tell us? A, B, P, E. We'll come to it later. Then this second triangle, which is P, E, B, and I'm going to label that C. So that second triangle, P, E, B, C. And what does that represent? And then our last triangle, which is P1, D, E. What does that represent? And now let's go through all of these. Now, a really early tip I give to students, which of course, when you're at the level of A stars, is you've pretty much, you know how to do this perfectly. But especially for year 12 students, I really try to emphasize for students, and it's a classical mistake, especially if you're stuck on C's, B's, is that students do not include their diagram enough in their question. So pretty much, every single point you label on your diagram, every bit of welfare loss, every quantity you talk about on your diagram, you label on your diagram, you need to somehow find the use of that in your analysis. Since one of the main limitations, one of the main problems with students is that they're constantly telling me, I don't know how to develop my chain of analysis, I have nothing to say. It's because you don't have good diagram technique, you don't know how to incorporate that diagram, and it's all to do with, again, depth of understanding. If you fully understand and can fully grasp the content knowledge behind the diagram, if you understand what it means, you will then be confident to use it in your chain of analysis. But yeah, what I would do here is just comment on the consumer surplus before and after, and then producer surplus before and after the subsidy, and you can use that to really incorporate into your chain of analysis, talking about the positive effects of the subsidy and how, again, you can link that to the electronics industry and how it encourages recycling, etc. But yeah, let's get started with consumer surplus before. Before that, how do you define consumer surplus? It's the difference between what consumers are willing to pay and what they actually pay. So the consumer surplus before, of course, how do you find it out before? So we're looking at our normal supply curve and then our normal demand curve, and it would just be this above the equilibrium, the triangle above the equilibrium. Therefore, it would be A, B, and PE. And the way I've got that is A, B, and PE. So now we've got the consumer surplus before the subsidy. Now let's find out the consumer surplus after. So the consumer surplus after the subsidy. Now how would I find that? Again, this is my S plus subsidy curve, and this is my demand curve. So now let's try find where we are, where the consumer surplus is now after the subsidy. So again, same thing, it's above the equilibrium point. So this triangle now, this triangle of A, D, P1 is now the triangle after. So this is how the consumer surplus changes after the subsidy. So A, D, P1. Okay, so that's the consumer surplus done. Of course, what can you say with regards to that in your chain of analysis? Literally say, you can talk about how for consumers who want to recycle, by setting a subsidy, of course, the lower price and the increased quantity will increase consumer surplus. Then thus you can say they're more likely, they have more incentive to recycle, of course, which addresses the question how to reduce wastage. Now let's do the same for producer surplus. So let's see producer surplus before the subsidy. So of course, before the subsidy, it's just a normal supply curve, and then we have our demand curve, and then what do we do from there? We go to the equilibrium and we go below the equilibrium. It's a triangle below the equilibrium, and what does that show? That shows B, PE, and then which point does that show? C. So BE, C is now the producer surplus before. Now let's find out the producer surplus after the subsidy. So again, we go to the S plus subsidy curve, and we go to the demand curve. We find the equilibrium there, which is there, and now let's find the triangle again below the equilibrium. So it's this triangle here. Now where these points relate? So P1 DE. So P1 DE is producer surplus after the subsidy. And that's just a little addition to the end of the chain analysis. This, if you've practiced this diagram, if you know how to manipulate it, I've had students say they can do this in literally a minute and a half, since it's very easy, and the amount of marks you'll get for this by using these, I would literally use exact every single one of these points. Don't just say consumer surplus increase, producer surplus increase. Say where it's increased from. It's increased from A, B, P, E. And what does that show your examiner? It shows your examiner you're a top level student. Since you've managed to label this on the diagram, then you've managed to incorporate it into your chain of analysis, and you've done it, and there's 4 different points here to incorporate. So definitely, when the examiner sees this, he sees you're a top level student, which is exactly what you're trying to get at. But yeah, that is how I would develop the chain of analysis for that second paragraph. Let's move on to the evaluation. I'm not going to go too much into depth with subsidy evaluation, since we've gone through it before, and it is quite simple. Just like we used for the last paragraph, you can of course talk about the size of the subsidy. The government does not have perfect information, and therefore they may, as we can see on the diagram, they may subsidise too few or too less units. For example, the subsidy might be here. Thus, so why is this government failure? They've intervened in the market, they've provided a subsidy. However, the subsidy has not had any significant effect on the market, since the quantity of recycled goods will only increase very small amount. Thus, you can say that is government failure, why they've intervened in the market and not massively improved the allocation of resources. Also, one of the big assumptions with the subsidy is that firms are profit maximizers and that firm will shift, they will increase supply. Whereas some firms, you can just subsidize them and they will just internalize that subsidy. They may just take it as increased shareholder profits. There's no guarantee that firms will actually shift out the supply curve, start producing more when you subsidize them. So it depends. So the way I'd word that evaluation point, it depends how a firm responds to a subsidy, as they may not actually increase supply, shift out the supply curve. Thus meaning, again, it's not the intended intention of the government, as of course they want these firms to increase quantity to receive these positive effects. So again, you can relate it to government failure. And there's many more you can talk about subsidies. You can talk about long run versus short run. Is it sustainable for the government to continually subsidise these firms? In the long run, if you continually subsidise firms, they may become reliant on the subsidy. They may become inefficient. You can talk about X inefficiency, where as they're being subsidised, the cost spiral, costs go out of control, and again, inefficiency. So there's lots of different evaluation points here. But yeah, we've gone quite into depth with that 50-mark question. I hope that's helped. And yeah, let's move on to section C.